Okay, this is an extension on the midpoint that we were working on in class today. And the midpoint formula is x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So this is our midpoint formula. Now let's start off with something very simple that we understand without even having to think. We have a point right here. Okay, this point is 2, 2. Then we have another point down here. Maybe. And this point is 2, negative 2. And then we have a line segment going between these. So here's my line segment, and I want to know what is the midpoint of this line. So I label my points x1, y1, x2, y2, and I plug them into my formula. So x1 is 2 plus x2 is 2 divided by 2, comma, y1 is 2 plus negative 2 is y2 divided by 2. So 2 plus 2 is 4 divided by 2. 2 plus negative 2 is 0 divided by 2. So 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 0 divided by 2 is 0. So we find out that this is our midpoint right here at 2, 0. And that makes sense. We can see that it has to be in the middle because there are 2 points above, or 2 units above and 2 units below the x-axis. So now let's look at it as in a table where we have our x's and our y's. We have an end point, a midpoint, and an end point. Okay, so I'm going to fill in my table. One of my endpoints is 2, 2. The other one is 2, negative 2. Okay, so what I need to figure out in order to do it this way rather than using my formula is I need to figure out what did I have to do to get from this point, this 2 right here, down to this 2 on my x-axis. So to get from 2 on my x-axis up here to 2 on my x-axis up here, along the x's I didn't change at all. I moved 0. So if I move 0 to go all the way from endpoint to endpoint, then I must move 0 also to go from endpoint to my midpoint and endpoint to my midpoint. So my x value is not going to change. Now on my y value, however, I went from 2 to negative 2. And if we look at that on a number line, here's 2, here's negative 2. Here's 1, here's 0, here's negative 1. So basically what I've done is I've subtracted 4. I've gone backwards 1, 2, 3, 4 to get from endpoint to midpoint. Well, since my midpoint's in the middle, I must subtract 2 or half of this 4 to get to my midpoint. So 2 minus 2 is 0. And that is how I would find my midpoint if I wanted to use this technique to do so. Now let me erase this and let's pretend for a second that we know the midpoint but we don't know the other endpoint. So we have an endpoint. Here's our endpoint. Here's our midpoint, and I want to know what is this endpoint. Well, we can look and see. We know we moved down 2 to get to here, so we've got to move down 2 more. So by common sense, we can see that that endpoint has to be negative 2, 0. But let's try doing that by the table. So we put, again, we're supposed to have an endpoint, a midpoint, and an endpoint. The midpoint must go in the middle. So I label what I know because this is what I'm trying to find. So I know that one of my endpoints is 2, 2. My midpoint is 2, 0. Now, I have to figure out what did I do to get from here to here. And the answer is I added 0. So to get from my endpoint to my midpoint, I added 0. Well, I need to do that again to get to my other endpoint. So I'm going to add 0. Now here, to get from 2 to 0, I subtracted 2. So I'm going to have to do that again to get to my other endpoint. So we find out that our other endpoint here is not at negative 2, 0. I don't even know why I said that. It's at negative 2, or 2, negative 2, right here. Okay, so let's look at one without really looking at it on the graph paper. Erase all the ink on the slide. Okay. Alright, so we're going to use the point, and I'm just going to randomly pick 3, negative 1, and the point 5, 8. Okay, so this is my end point, and this is my midpoint, and I want to know what is my other endpoint. So I'm going to set up my T-chart. I've got an endpoint, a midpoint, and an endpoint in that order. So I start with my endpoint, 3, negative 1. My midpoint is 5, 8. Okay, so I figure out, what did I do to get from here to here? 3 to 5, I add 2. Well, if I do that to get from one endpoint to my point in the middle, I have to do that again to get to my other endpoint. So I add 2, and I get 7. Now from here to here, I'm actually adding 9, because the 8 to get from 0 plus this extra 1. So I have to add 9 again to get to my other endpoint, and 8 plus 9 is 17. So my other endpoint is 7, 17. Okay, let's work one more this way. Let's see here. Let's try negative 8, 4, and this is one endpoint, and this one is 10, negative 6, and this is my midpoint. Alright, so right here I want you to pause the video and see if you can figure it out, and then I'll work it and you can come back and look at it. So here's my XY T-chart, endpoint, midpoint, endpoint. So my endpoint is negative 8, 4. My midpoint is 10, negative 6. So to get from negative 8 to 10, I add 18. Okay, and this, you could do this trial and error. You could do 10 minus negative 8 gives me 18, so that's what I had to add. So now I'm going to have to add that again. 10 plus 18 is 28. Now here you've got negative 6 minus 4, so that's negative 10. So what I actually did here was subtract 10. So I need to subtract 10 again, so I get negative 16. So if you see what I did, I took the point of my midpoint, the 10, and I subtract my endpoint point. I take my midpoint, subtract my endpoint, and that tells me what I do. If it's positive, I'm adding. If it's negative, I'm subtracting. So my midpoint is now 28, negative 16. I mean my other endpoint, sorry. Let's do one more down here. Let's do 15, 27 is an endpoint, and my midpoint is negative 12, 14. So set up my T-chart, XY. Here is my endpoint, and that is going to be 15, 27. My midpoint is negative 12, 14. So to see what I do here, I'm going to take my midpoint of my x's, negative 12, minus my endpoint x, 15, and that is negative 27. So what I'm doing to get from here to here is subtracting 27. So I have to do that again. Negative 12 minus 27 is negative 39. Now I have to do this side, 27 to 14. So I go 14 minus 27. And there I get negative 13. So that means I'm subtracting 13. So I need to subtract 13 again. 14 minus 13 is 1. Excuse me. So my other endpoint is negative 39, 1. So I hope this clears a little bit of it up for you, and we'll talk about it tomorrow in class.